It was a quiet morning on the coast, the kind where the air still smells like salt and sawdust. William Hart, 68, ran a rag over his old workbench one more time, even though there wasn't much left to fix. The workshop felt too still without his late wife humming somewhere in the kitchen. Every birthday since she passed had been the same, just him, a cup of coffee, and the sound of the tide knocking gently against the dock he built with his own hands. That afternoon, his phone buzzed. A message from his son lit up the screen. "Dad, dinner at 7, wear something nice." William smiled. It had been months since he'd seen David in person. The kid was always busy saving lives, flying off to conferences, shaking hands with people whose suits probably cost more than William's truck. Still, an invitation was an invitation. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe they'd laugh again. He ironed the shirt his wife once said made him look proper, pulled on the wool jacket she knitted before the chemo took her away. He even stopped at the corner shop to buy a small bottle of wine. Nothing fancy, but something that tasted like care. When he arrived at the restaurant, the kind with soft jazz and napkins folded like origami, he hesitated at the door. Through the glass, he saw his son, David in a tailored suit, Clara beside him, radiant and polished like the kind of woman who'd never know the smell of glue or varnish. They were already surrounded by people William didn't recognize, law partners, family friends from her side, all laughing like they owned the air in the room. "Dad." David stood up, but his smile was the polite kind, more habit than warmth. He motioned toward an empty chair near the end of the table. William sat down, adjusting the sleeves of his worn jacket, suddenly aware of every callus on his hands. When the waiter poured wine, David raised his glass. "I have an announcement," he said, grinning. "I just wired $100,000 to Clara's father, my way of thanking him for everything he's done for us." The table erupted in applause. Clara leaned in and kissed his cheek. Someone joked about keeping it in the family, and William felt his chest tighten. He smiled anyway. Then David reached into his coat pocket. "And for you, Dad," he said, sliding a small envelope across the table. William opened it carefully, half expecting a card, maybe a photo. Inside was a $10 voucher for a car repair shop. David chuckled. "Thought you could use it for your old truck. It's kinda outdated like you." The laughter was instant, light, careless, cruel. William's hand trembled slightly, but he kept his smile steady. Years of sanding wood had taught him how to hide the shake. He looked around the table, faces he didn't know, all amused by a joke they thought was harmless. But to him, it wasn't a joke. It was a sentence. A lifetime of sacrifice dismissed in a single punchline. He lifted his glass, his voice quiet but steady. "Well, here's to keeping old things running, I guess." A few people laughed again, not realizing the weight in his tone. When the dinner ended, he thanked his son, hugged Clara, and walked out into the night air. The cool wind hit his face like truth. He stood there for a moment, staring at the reflection of the restaurant lights on his truck's windshield. It was scratched, yes. The paint was fading. But every dent on that truck had a story: moving lumber, taking David to school, driving to the hospital the day his wife passed. William rested his hand on the hood. "Outdated," he whispered, a small smile forming. "Maybe, but still running." He climbed in, turned the key, and the engine growled alive, stubborn, loyal, familiar. As he drove home along the dark coastline, the only sound was the hum of the road and the beating in his chest. Sometimes, he thought, the cruelest words don't come from strangers. They come from the ones you built your whole life around. But what they don't know is this: Even the quietest fathers have a breaking point and a plan. If stories like this one strike a chord with you, don't forget to stick around. There's more to come, more lessons, more reckonings, more stories about love, loss, and the quiet kind of strength that never goes out of style. The night was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes you hear things you'd rather forget. William sat alone in his workshop, the smell of cedar still faint in the air, though the sawdust had long settled. A single lamp flickered above his head, throwing weak light over shelves lined with tools that hadn't been touched in years. In the corner stood the half-finished boat, the one he and David started when his son was 10. The wood was dry now, cracked at the edges, but still held the shape of something that could have been beautiful. William ran his hand over it, tracing the same grain his boy once sanded, and for a second he heard it, David's laughter, small and bright, filling the whole room, then silence again. He opened the old drawer beneath the bench, the one that still squeaked when pulled. Inside was a photo, his late wife, smiling in front of that same boat, holding a coffee mug that said Hart's hands build forever. Tucked behind the frame was a note in her handwriting. You build things that last. Will, don't let the world make you small. He read it out loud, voice shaking just a little. Things that last, he whispered. Guess people aren't one of them. He sat back in his chair and let the memories pour in. The second job at the shipyard, the nights he came home too tired to eat, the loan he took to cover David's first semester of med school, the tools he sold to help pay for the second. Every sacrifice, every callous, every sleepless night, all so the kid could stand taller than he ever did. And tonight, that same son called him outdated. The word echoed like a hammer strike in his head. He looked at his hands, cracked, veined, and strong, the same hands that built everything his son had ever stood on. He used to think love was about giving everything, even the last piece of yourself. But now he wasn't so sure. Maybe love without respect was just slow erosion. The clock ticked past midnight. He didn't even bother going to bed. He just sat there staring at the photo until the light outside turned blue. When morning came, he brewed a pot of coffee and carried it to the small desk by the window. The sea mist hung low over the shore. He opened his bank book, the same one he'd kept since the 80s. Page after page of handwritten deposits, every dollar earned through sweat and splinters. At the bottom, $920,000. He let out a low whistle. Not bad for an old man with an outdated truck. He stared at the number for a long time, then smiled, a different kind of smile this time. Not bitter, not proud, just knowing. He thinks I've got nothing left, he muttered, leaning back in his chair. Maybe that's my greatest advantage. There was something freeing about it. For once, no one expected anything from him. No tuition to pay, no house to fix, no one waiting on him to show up. The world had finally gone quiet enough for him to hear his own thoughts, and the truth hiding beneath them. He didn't need to chase his son's approval anymore. He didn't need to prove his worth to anyone who measured it in dollars or degrees. What he built with his hands was real, and it had outlasted everyone's laughter. As the sun rose, he picked up his wife's old note again and pinned it to the wall above the workbench. The paper was yellowed, the ink fading, but the words still carried weight. Don't let the world make you small. For the first time in years, he felt a quiet kind of strength settling in his chest, not the kind that roars or fights, the kind that rebuilds. He took a deep breath, looked at the unfinished boat, and whispered, "Maybe it's time to finish what I started." Outside, the waves rolled steady against the shore like applause from something bigger than him. And in that moment, William Hart, The man everyone thought had nothing left began to build again. The next few weeks slipped by quietly, but something inside William had shifted. He didn't wake up thinking about what he'd lost anymore. He woke up wondering what else he could still build. Most mornings, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a notebook full of scribbles, stock terms, investment podcasts, advice from people half his age. He didn't understand everything at first, but that didn't stop him. After all, he'd taught himself to build boats from nothing but wood and instinct. Numbers couldn't be that different. One afternoon, he found himself in a small coastal office across from a young financial advisor named Evelyn. She was bright, confident, maybe 30 at most, with salt-streaked hair and a voice full of steady optimism. "You've been building ships your whole life," she said, smiling as she flipped through his notes. "Let's build your freedom now." William chuckled, a little embarrassed. "Freedom, huh? Never thought of it that way." "That's because you spent your life giving it to everyone else," she replied without missing a beat. "Now it's your turn." Her words landed like the sound of a nail driven clean, sharp, solid, final. He started small, a few investments, some savings repositioned, a plan that actually put him at the center for once. Evelyn taught him how to track growth, how to recognize opportunity, how to make his money work while he worked less. But the old carpenter couldn't sit still for long. A few months later, while walking by the marina, he saw a dusty sign on a weathered shack, "For sale, old boatyard." He stopped. The place was nothing fancy: cracked windows, tools rusted from salt air, seagulls nesting on the roof, but he could see it, the potential. That evening he called Evelyn. "How much do you think a dream like that costs?" She laughed softly. "Depends on who's dreaming, Mr. Hart." By spring he owned it. The Hart boathouse was back, smaller than the one he'd sold years ago, but this time it was his alone. No debts, no partners, just a space that smelled like sawdust and salt water, the way life should. But William didn't stop there. He opened the doors every weekend to a group of local kids from tough backgrounds who reminded him of his younger self. He taught them how to use a plane, how to read the curve of a hull, how patience could shape wood better than brute force. They called him Mr. W, and every time one of them sanded a plank smooth, he felt a piece of himself being rebuilt too. One late afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the slats, his phone buzzed on the workbench. "David." He wiped his hands on his apron before answering. "Hey, Dad," came the familiar, confident tone. "Listen, I need you to co-sign a loan for the clinic expansion. It's just a formality, but they want a secondary guarantor. You know how banks are." William looked around at the young men carefully measuring wood, at the smell of varnish, at the ocean beyond the window. He smiled quietly to himself. "Can't do it, son," he said. There was a pause. "What? Why not? You always—" "I'm busy this week," William interrupted gently. "My students are waiting." He could almost hear the disbelief on the other end. "Students? What are you talking about?" "I'll call you later, David," William said calmly, and this time he was the one who hung up first. He stood there for a moment, phone still in hand, then set it down and turned back toward the boat frame they were building. "All right, boys," he said with a grin. "Who's ready to learn how to bend a keel?" Laughter filled the workshop, light and warm, the kind of sound he hadn't heard in years. That night, as he locked up the boathouse, he paused by the door and looked back at the glow of the lamps inside. For the first time in a long time, he felt no guilt for saying no. He didn't feel like a burden. He didn't feel small. He felt enough. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitterness. It was something deeper, a quiet pride, the kind that comes when a man finally stands tall on his own terms. The world outside was calm, waves tapping the shore like a heartbeat. And as William walked home beneath the fading light, he whispered to himself almost like a prayer, "Yeah, I'm building again, just not for them this time." 3 months later, the old neighborhood barely recognized him. William sold his small house by the docks and moved closer to the lake, not for luxury, not for show, but for something far more satisfying. On a quiet stretch of water, right beside the gated mansion where his son and daughter-in-law now lived, stood a new building, part workshop, part gallery, all Hart. It had big glass windows, cedar beams, and the kind of smell that only honest wood carries. Above the entrance, carved by his own hands, hung a polished wooden sign that read, "Hart Craftsmanship since 1983. The grand opening was supposed to be small, just friends, neighbors, and the few students who'd been helping him rebuild boats, but word travels fast in small towns. By noon there were cameras, reporters, curious locals. Someone from the community paper called him the man who rebuilt more than boats. He laughed, cheeks red but eyes bright. When the interviewer asked, "So, Mr. Hart, what made you start all this again at your age?" William grinned and said, "Some men build houses, I build peace. This place, it's my peace." The clip aired that night on the local channel, then someone posted it online. Within days, it hit every feed in town and eventually every screen in the hospital where David worked. "Hey, Doc," one of the nurses called out during a break, waving her phone. "Isn't this your dad, the carpenter? He's all over Facebook. They're calling him the man who built his second life." A few co-workers gathered around, watching William on the video, smiling in his crisp white shirt, standing proud in front of the sign. Someone joked, "Man, your dad's kind of famous now." David froze. For the first time, he had no smart reply, no joke to hide behind, just silence. That night, long after the hospital halls went quiet, he drove out toward the lake. The headlights swept across the water until they caught the glow of the workshop, golden light spilling from the windows, music faintly playing inside. He parked across the road and stood there for a moment, just watching. His father looked different, younger somehow, surrounded by people laughing, talking, asking questions. A few reporters held cameras, flashing as William shook hands and smiled. David walked closer, the crunch of gravel under his shoes breaking the rhythm of the evening. When William turned and saw him, the crowd's chatter faded for a second. "Dad," David said quietly, eyes scanning the polished walls, the elegant setup, the boats displayed like art. "You bought this." William looked around at the beams, the smell of varnish, the life humming around him, then met his son's eyes with a calm that carried years of silence. "No, son," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I built this." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy enough to make David drop his gaze. It wasn't anger in his father's tone. It wasn't revenge. It was something far more cutting, pride, earned, not granted. The reporter turned back toward them, smiling. "Mr. Hart, would you mind standing by the sign for a photo?" "Sure thing," William said, resting his hand on the carved letters. The flash went off, and in that moment the camera caught more than an image. It caught justice. There he was, the man once mocked for being outdated, now celebrated as a craftsman, a teacher, a name that meant something again. And his son standing just behind the crowd, realizing the world had finally seen what he'd been too blind to notice. William didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Every laugh, every handshake, every headline did the talking for him. When the last of the guests left and the lights dimmed, he walked out to the dock alone. The water reflected the soft shimmer of the workshop behind him. He breathed in deep, the smell of cedar and lake air, the scent of his new beginning. Behind him, David's voice broke the silence. "Dad, I didn't know you still had this in you." William smiled faintly, not turning around. "Son, I never lost it. You just stopped looking." The night breeze carried their words over the lake, quiet, steady, final. And as the camera panned out from the shining sign, Hart craftsmanship since 1983, the audience could feel it. The balance restored, the pride reclaimed, and the justice every father like him deserved. The workshop was quiet that night. The smell of cedar still hung in the air, and the soft hum of the lake outside filled the silence between two men who'd run out of excuses. David stood near the doorway, still in his hospital scrubs, shoulders heavy, eyes darting around the office as if trying to make sense of what his father had become. His gaze fell on the framed newspaper clipping on the wall, "Local craftsman rebuilds his legacy." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know you had this much money, Dad," he finally said, his voice tight. William didn't look up from the piece of wood he was sanding. "You never asked." The sound of the sandpaper stopped. He set it down, exhaled slowly, and looked at his son, really looked at him. There was no anger in his eyes, just the kind of calm that comes after a storm. "You know," William said quietly, "it wasn't the money that hurt me. It was the silence. The birthdays you forgot. The phone calls that stopped. The time I was sick and you sent money for a nurse who never came. The night you looked me in the eye and called me outdated on my birthday in front of strangers." David's face crumpled, his voice cracking. "Dad, please, I didn't mean." "Yes, you did," William said gently, cutting him off. "And that's all right. Because for the first time in a long time you were honest. You didn't want me around. You wanted a version of me that fit in your new life, the kind that didn't remind you where you came from." David stepped closer, eyes wet. "I was ashamed, not of you," he said, his voice trembling, "but of not being like them, of being the kid with the calloused hands father. Everyone else's parents wore suits, drove new cars. I wanted to belong." William nodded slowly, picking up the wooden carving on his desk, a small sailboat he'd made when David was 10. "You think I don't get that," he said softly. "I spent years wanting to belong too, belong to your world, to your life. But you can't buy your way into someone's heart. Not with money, not with fancy dinners, not even with $100,000 wired to the wrong person." David wiped his eyes, voice breaking. "I messed everything up." William leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "Then learn the difference, son, between success and worth. One's built," he said, tapping the wood gently, "and one's bought. And anything that's bought doesn't last." David's breath hitched. He looked around the room again, at the shelves lined with old photos, at the boat blueprints, at the little wooden sign that said Hart craftsmanship. Everything in that room was built by hand, by patience, love, and pain. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he whispered. William smiled faintly. "Maybe not yet, but forgiveness isn't something you deserve, David. It's something you grow into." There was a long pause. Only the sound of the waves filled the space between them. "You know," William said after a moment, looking out the window, "when you gave me that $10 gift card, I thought it was the cruelest thing anyone could have done. But now," he smiled, eyes distant, "I think it might have been the best gift you ever gave me." David blinked. "What, how?" William turned back to him, his voice low but steady. "Because some gifts hurt first before they heal." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the air itself needed time to take in the words. David nodded slowly, tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry, Dad. William stood up, walked around the desk, and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then start showing it," he said softly. "Not with money, with presence, with time." David nodded again, unable to speak. William gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You can rebuild a house, a boat, a career, but rebuilding trust, that takes more than nails and wood. It takes every day. And I'm still here, so maybe, just maybe, we've got time." Outside, the moonlight reflected off the calm water, illuminating the name carved on the dock, Hart's craftsmanship. And for the first time in years, father and son stood side by side in silence, not perfect, not fixed, but finally facing the same direction. It was a Sunday morning when Clara showed up at the workshop. The smell of pine filled the air, and William was planing the edge of a new boat hull when he heard her voice behind him. "Mr. Hart." He turned, wiping the dust from his hands onto his apron. Clara stood there, her hair a little messy, eyes red like she'd been crying, but this time it wasn't from pride or anger, it was something softer. "Clara," he said gently, "did something happen?" She smiled through her tears. "Something good, actually." She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." For a second, the world stopped. The sunlight pouring through the window landed right on her face, and William just stared, trying to take it in. She continued, her voice trembling a little. "David's changed, Mr. Hart. I don't know when it happened, but he finally sees you. He talks about you all the time. About your patience, your hands, your work. He says he wants our child to know the kind of strength you have." William said nothing. He just stood there, his throat tight, eyes glistening as memories of his late wife flashed through his mind, her laughter, the way she used to hold David as a baby, the smell of cedar on her clothes after long days in the workshop. He blinked hard, forcing a small smile. "You're gonna be a good mother, Clara," he said softly. "And he's gonna be a better man than I ever was." She shook her head. "He already thinks you're the best man he's ever known." Months passed. The workshop kept running, the town kept buzzing, and life for once felt full again. When the day came, Clara gave birth to a baby girl. David called that same night, voice trembling with pride. "Dad," he said, "she's perfect. We named her Willow Hart." William froze. "Willow?" "Yeah," David said, his voice breaking. "Clara wanted something that reminded us of strength that bends but doesn't break. And we wanted her to carry your name, Dad. You built the roots of this family. We just hope she grows from them." William couldn't speak. He just sat there, the phone pressed to his ear, eyes wet with the kind of tears that only come once or twice in a lifetime, the kind that don't fall from pain but from peace. A few weeks later, he finally held her, little Willow, wrapped in a soft blanket, her tiny fingers gripping one of his calloused ones like she was holding on to something ancient. He rocked her gently by the window of the workshop, where the smell of cedar mixed with the faint scent of baby powder. The sun slipped low behind the water, painting the walls gold. He looked down at her and smiled. "Hey there, little one," he whispered, his voice rough but tender. "You've got your daddy's stubbornness, I can already tell. But listen to me, Willow, don't let the world measure you by its noise. Build quiet things that last." Her eyelids fluttered, her breathing slow and steady. He hummed softly, the same tune he used to sing to David all those years ago, when the world still felt small and simple. Outside, the sign on the workshop gleamed in the dusk, Hart craftsmanship, since 1983. As he rocked his granddaughter to sleep, he thought about all the storms that had come and gone, all the things he'd lost and rebuilt. He realized something that night: legacies aren't made of money or property or even blood. They're made of the moments that outlive us, the lessons that stick long after we're gone. Years from now, Someone might walk into that same shop and see a photograph of William Hart, gray-haired, eyes kind, holding a baby by the window, and they'll say, "That's the man who built things that lasted." But for now, the only sound was the soft creak of the chair and the rhythm of a baby's breath against his chest. And as the lake shimmered outside, William closed his eyes and whispered, half to himself, half to the woman he once loved, "We did it, sweetheart. We finally built something that'll last." 2 years later, the hall was filled with the hum of polite conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the faint scent of polished wood and coffee. The annual banquet for the local business association had drawn quite a crowd: bankers, entrepreneurs, city officials, the kind of people who usually talked about profit margins and market trends. But tonight, the keynote speaker wasn't a CEO. It was a man in his late 60s, wearing a simple gray suit and an easy smile, William Hart. As he stepped up to the podium, the room went quiet. David sat in the front row, his wife Clara beside him, their little daughter Willow on her lap, clutching a tiny wooden toy boat. William adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and looked out across the faces, some familiar, some new. "When they asked me to talk about fathers and the value of work," he began, voice steady, "I didn't know if I was the right man for the job. I'm not a businessman, never was. I built things with my hands, boats, chairs, sometimes a life that didn't always stay afloat." A few quiet laughs rippled through the audience. He smiled faintly. "But I do know something about building. I know that anything that lasts, a home, a business, a family, takes time. It takes patience. And it takes respect. Because respect isn't inherited." He paused, his eyes finding David's in the crowd. "It's built, nail by nail, word by word." You could have heard a pin drop. William continued, "My father used to say, don't aim to leave money behind. Leave something your children can stand on." It took me a lifetime to understand what he meant. You see, I thought love meant giving everything away. But real love, real legacy, is when your children finally see you not as a giver, but as a man who stood tall even when the world looked down. His voice wavered just a little, but he didn't flinch. "I built my life out of mistakes, wood, and stubbornness. And somehow, it turned into something that lasted. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's that worth isn't measured in noise or numbers. It's measured in the quiet things you build when no one's watching." Applause filled the room, not the kind that's polite, but the kind that lingers. David stood first, clapping through tears, pride and remorse mixing on his face. Clara squeezed his hand, whispering something only he could hear. After the speech, people gathered to shake William's hand. He took each one humbly, laughing, thanking them. When the crowd thinned, David approached, holding a small velvet box. "Dad," he said softly, "I wanted to give you something." William chuckled. "You already gave me more than I could have asked for." David smiled shyly and opened the box. Inside was a silver watch, simple but elegant. The back was engraved with a single line, "For the man who taught me time doesn't make value, effort does." William ran his thumb over the engraving, then looked up at his son. "You know," he said with a grin, "that might just be the best return on investment I've ever made." They laughed, the kind of laughter that only comes after everything that needed to be said has already been said. Later that evening, when most guests had gone, William stood outside under the string lights looking out over the lake. The reflection of the moon rippled gently on the surface. David came to stand beside him, silent for a while, just watching. "She's growing fast," William said, nodding toward the thought of his granddaughter at home. "Yeah," David replied softly. "She's got your eyes, you know." William chuckled. "Poor kid. They both laughed quietly. After a moment, David added, "You were right, Dad, about everything. Success doesn't mean a damn thing if it costs you respect." William turned toward him, smiling faintly. "And you were right about one thing too, son." David looked confused. "What's that?" William clapped him gently on the shoulder. "You did make it. Just took the long way home." The two men stood there for a long time, father and son, no longer at odds, just two builders looking at the same horizon. When William finally walked away, his steps were slow but sure, like a man who'd finished what he came to do. The next morning, the town paper ran a headline. "Local craftsman reminds us what legacy really means." And beneath it, a photo, William Hart, smiling modestly beside his son, holding that silver watch. A full circle, complete at last. A father's love isn't loud, it's steady. But when ignored long enough, even silence learns to speak. Build what lasts, not what shines. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Family Shadows. May every parent watching this be seen, heard, and respected.